the next 1,000 years, I still be a rock of
Pleasure to be here, and I've followed one or two of the Friday seminars. I've missed a couple recently because of traveling and so on, but I enjoy them very much, and it's something nice to have on a Friday afternoon. Africa and Europe, the expression, I wish it was mine, but it isn't. It goes back to the naturalist, hunter, explorer of the 19th century, Abel Chapman. And he was talking about an area that I've referred to, which is very close to here, Coto Doñana, or at the time was the Coto Doñana, the Doñana National Park in Spain. And in many ways, he captured and perceived the feelings that I want to put across to you today. And really, my aim is to perhaps not so much present detailed results, but to stimulate perhaps discussion and a way of viewing the world, which is quite different, because I've been working with birds for longer than I can remember. I'm giving my age away, but it'll be 40, 50 years now, 50 years more likely. And I've always had a problem. I live here in Gibraltar, in the extreme south. You can't get further south in Europe than Gibraltar. And I always had a problem with ecological, climatological interpretations from people from the north of Europe. Such basic things as spring, summer, autumn, winter, which don't make sense when you're living this far south. So it's a little bit of that I want to explore with you today, and I hope we can stimulate a bit of discussion. Let me start. Well, I think I've already mentioned that I do a lot of photography as well. It's great fun to do this. And I've only put this picture in. Don't worry, it's not a photographic show today. But this is a short-tailed snake eagle. You all recognize it. And if I think Ugo's listening, I'm sending it your way. It's one of the ones that's going to one of your sites. Well, we've had a huge passage of these birds this last week, all the adult birds, and they're coming across from Africa to the breeding grounds in Europe. And Ugo spoke about this a few weeks ago, so I'm not going to go to this at length, but just an image to situate the location and to make sense of the picture that's coming up next. So here we are. This is Gibraltar. I think the cursor might work. No, there's a cursor work here. So here's Gibraltar. It's a big lump of rock. Technically, it's in Europe. And here's North Africa. This is the coast of North Africa. And the distance from here to here is 21 kilometers. And there are places along here where it's even less. It's down to 14 kilometers. And I've put the latitude and longitude here because I think it's relevant. Part of the point that I'm going to be making is that there's a greater affinity between this and this than there would be between this, say, and the Alps, for example. Yeah, and I'm talking ecologically and bioclimatically and so on. But bear in mind, 36 degrees north, it's not quite tropical, but it's almost there. But when you look at the next, and this may surprise some of you, the white line, more or less tracking curvature of the Earth, is the latitude of Gibraltar. And the point I'm making here is that there are parts of North Africa that are actually further north than Gibraltar, as you can see in parts here of Tunisia and Algeria and so on. So this is the southerly position of Gibraltar. And when we come to talk about birds and affinities and so on, I think it's very important to bear these things in mind. Certainly has more affinity with this than this would have with anything up here, like I've said. Now, this is from Rivas Martinez, a bioclimatic map of the world. We don't have to worry too much about it. But the point I'm going to make here is that in yellow, you have Europe is there, the green, temperate Europe. In fact, further up, you have Boreal and Arctic. And of course, further south, you have the more tropical bioclimates. But again, to stress the point, like the bioclimates of temperate Europe will reach the northern parts of Spain, but further south it's quite different, especially if we look down here. At that scale, you can't see the differences. But if we come down here and zoom in a little bit more, here we go. You can see, and don't pay too much attention to the legend here, because the authors of the paper got the labeling wrong, but I'll clarify. You can see the yellow is the thermo-Mediterranean. This is the warmest part of the Mediterranean thermotypes and bioclimates. As you can see, it covers this area of the Guadalquivir down to Gibraltar, a little bit here. Already here, you're getting into Meso-Mediterranean, and you can see the affinity, the similar bioclimates along this coast of North Africa. Once you start getting up here, then you're getting for the colder Mediterranean bioclimates, and a lot of that has to do with altitude, and then you go into the different world of temperate. Just to complete that picture, if instead of thermotypes we look at ombrotypes, rainfall patterns, again we can see that because of the Atlantic influence, we're quite a way to the west. We have a lot of green, which is subhumid, mixed with a mosaic with brown bioclimates, brown being dry, similar to what you have on the other side. It's only further, as you go further south, that you get into arid, hyper-arid, and semi-arid bioclimates. So very much similarities there. And the boundary is just a short stretch of water, and perhaps it's more in our minds geopolitically than in real terms. This is the kind of place that I've been working for many, many years now. This is within the Doñana National Park in the Biological Reserve. We had a number of projects here. And I'm just going to put a couple of pictures just to illustrate to you how different this kind of bioclimate is in relation to anything that you might find anywhere else further to the north. You get these kinds of savannas we see with a lot of water birds breeding and so on. Open kind of Mediterranean-like savannas, if you like, but this is the kind of landscape that we're looking at. Seasonal lakes, and the environments and the climates are very, very seasonal. Summer, as we will come up in a moment, very dry summers and very wet winters. So you have these kind of seasonal lakes and a lot of areas with dune systems. Again, here we have white storks on the move in this kind of environment. I mean, you wouldn't associate this kind of world with anything in sort of temperate Europe, for example, but you might associate it quite clearly with certainly North Africa and maybe even further down. So one of the things that I'd like to comment, and I've really just remarked on it already, is this idea of a wet season and a dry season. Because when I look at the world down here, it's not about spring, summer, autumn, winter. It is about a wet season and a dry season, and everything revolves around that. And the bad season is the summer. The bad season is the dry season, and the rest of the year is when things move in. So I'll say a little bit more in a minute, but just working with storks for a moment, and some of this may be obvious to some of you, but I'm just sharing my thoughts. But looking at the white storks, and this from some work I did a little while ago, but all I'm going to highlight here is mean monthly rainfall in different parts of the geographical range, annual range of the Iberian white stork. So here, Gibraltar, where we are, and as you can see here in the months of July, August, and September, and even June, this is a dry season for us. And then it's in October that you begin to get the onset of the rains. Some years, like this year, the rains don't start until December. Come a bit further south in Morocco, very similar pattern. Slightly less rainfall, but the pattern is identical. But now once we get across into Mauritania, very little rainfall, but the little rainfall that there is actually in August, September, October. And then when we look at further south into the Sahel in Mali, we see a mirror image of this pattern. In other words, the rainfall is happening when there is no rainfall where we are. And I think this is an important thing to bear in mind. So a lot of white storks actually for the last few decades don't migrate, and haven't migrated probably because the climate is mild enough, but also importantly because of their attendance to rubbish tips, which means there's food available to them the year round. But a lot of them still migrate. You get some spectacular migrations of white storks across the Strait of Gibraltar. And I've put here the two extreme rainfall maps in Gibraltar and here in Mali. And what I want to simply highlight is this, that here we are in July, the start of the dry season, And that is the peak, July and early August is the peak migration south of the white stork, of the Iberian white storks. They've gone by the middle of August. And we know they go into the Sahel, and they're arriving at the beginning of the rains, or hitting the rains. And then in reverse, once you begin to get the dry season in the south, people are sometimes surprised when I say to them that in October, the storks are arriving from Africa and they're moving north. And that builds up towards particularly November, December, and January. So by the time January has arrived, all the storks have come back. So this, you will agree, has nothing to do with any kind of traditional pattern that you might associate with spring migration north and autumn migration south. This, to me, has more affinity with perhaps what might be an intratropical African migration related to rainfall. And yet it is technically between Africa and a part of Europe. Let me highlight another one, which is the swallow, the common swallow, nowadays called the barn swallow. I still call it the swallow. But this is another example. You see, one of the things that I found very funny and interesting in respect of swallow and many other species is you see these accounts of people who come to this part of the world and they say, oh, you have wintering swallows. Because they come, they have this concept of the winter, and they come and they'll see swallows and they see this as a rare thing. What they don't realize is that the swallows return from Africa. These southern populations of swallows return from Africa in January. These swallows would already be raising the first brood and getting ready to raise the second brood. And the reason they come early is because the food supply is there. And I remember working in Doñana very often, you would get up in the morning in January and the water would be frozen. You'd be maybe -5 degrees, but it doesn't matter if you're an aerial insect forager, because by noon or 1 in the afternoon, the temperatures were up in the 20s and there were insects everywhere. So it doesn't really matter. So the swallows come in, they have this incredible harvest of insects available to them. The days are getting longer very quickly here already in January. After the 21st of December, you can begin to see. So there is enough feeding time to raise these broods. And of course, the trick with the swallow, like with the storks, is that come June and the drought, they go away. So the Iberian swallows in July and August have gone. That is their bad time of year. That is their winter. The Iberian swallow's winter is what we would traditionally consider to be summer. So we have to change the chip a little bit to understand these things. And I think it's very, very important. So when people come from the north and say they have records of wintering swallows in Iberia, they don't. What they have is the swallows that have arrived, and this applies to house martins and many other species. Interesting thing is, and we have to look at this from a population point of view, some of these swallows coming towards maybe May, June, maybe even on a second or even a third brood. And it is then you still see swallows migrating north, going towards Scandinavia. So when you have migrated swallows coming from Africa to Northern Europe, the Iberian swallows are already on the second and possibly a third brood and getting ready to go south. Okay, let's change the chip a little bit now to a more temporal dimension. Right, this is from a paper published a number of years ago now by Pickford and Morales. But I think it's very interesting, gives us some very interesting insights. So bear with me, I'll describe what we're seeing here. Here on and I'm going deep time here. So here the arrow gives you the time scale, which is in millions of years, okay? So we're going from 0 to maybe 22 million years. The point I'm going to make is that when you look at it, this is the boundary between the Palearctic and the Ethiopian or Afrotropical zoogeographical regions today. That is more or less the position. But when you go back in time, the position will be there. You see that it hasn't always been in the same position. It has fluctuated. And there are times when that boundary was north of the Pyrenees, meaning that most of this part of the world that I'm describing was within, in geographical terms, was within the Afrotropical or Ethiopian realms, if you like. And this is very interesting when you compare faunas. And again, here you've got the scale millions of years, but look at what this is showing. These are moments in red, and they were comparing the large mammal taxa in Spain with East Africa. And these are shared taxa. These are moments when the mammal faunas of East Africa and Spain had in common. And here are moments when in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, you had the presence of crocodiles. So things change at different timescales. Things are not always as static as sometimes us you look at things at present and forget that things are not as static at different timescales. Now, let's forget the millions of years. I'm going to bring you now to something more recent than the kind of work that I do, which is, apart from contemporary, I look at the Pleistocene. Now, this is a standard map you'll identify very easily, bioclimatic map. Highlights in white the barrier that is today the Sahara Desert. To the north, you have the Mediterranean bioclimates. Now you have sort of belts of grassland, woodland, and so on. So that would be a present-day model and something that would have been occurring at times in the past. Now, this is from a paper published a few years ago now by Rick Telingi, and it's extremely interesting. The time scale here is from 120,000 years ago to the present. So it's the last glacial cycle. And the last glacial cycle would be characterized by an interglacial around here, 125,000 years ago, an interglacial meaning a warm period, like today, we are in a warm period. And then for the rest of the time in between, conditions were cooler. But what you find, for example, and if you look at the vegetation from pollen in the Sahara, taken in the Sahara, you find that there are moments, like in stage 5C, a warm, humid period, stage 5A, and more recently, after 10,000, maybe 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, that the grass fraction represented in the Sahara is actually as high. Here, down here, we have the equivalent in the Sahel. These equate to rainfall. And if we look at the Sahel in the lower, what we find, you have an increase in the tree fraction. Okay, so clearly the signal is giving us humidity and a lot of vegetation, certainly in the Sahel and also in what is the Sahara. What this does is it changes our picture, because now instead of a desert in between, what you have is largely wooded grasslands. Look at the size of the mega time and look at the drainage basins. Some people have said a corridor when talking about access from people from one side to the other. I'd like not to think of it as a corridor. This is a zone in its own right, which has been set a day, and we see it from the perspective of today and not the past, but very, very often what the map looked like. Okay. Here's another one from another example from a paper by Nick Drake, just to reinforce the point. And what we have here is the distribution of Nile crocodile distribution, but you have these lakes, swamps. But look how interesting you have in red dots historical records of Nile crocodile, and in white you have fossils of Nile crocodile, just to reinforce the point. And in light blue you have rock art, which means people were living here. This is a world that we have lost, at least temporarily, maybe longer, but which must have been an absolutely wonderful world. Now, what this does is then, when talking about going back to storks and swallows and so on, effectively what it does is the relations that I'm describing up here in the red. So storks can get through because they have flights, they're able to fly, but this is part of the system, even with a barrier in between, as we have seen. But there were times, and if we use a traffic light analogy, when actually this was part of a continuum. So what we're seeing here with the storks is, if you like, a severed picture, one that has been cut by a desert, and makes us think of what's down here as being Africa, what's up here, but it is a system, and it's related to a large degree to rainfall. I hope this makes sense. What next? Well, and this is just to touch on this. If we think of this Sahara as a moving barrier, which is not a barrier all the time, then, and this is an open question I'm leaving to you, what does it do to the migration of these trans-Saharan migrants? They must have had it easy at some points, and a lot of these areas may well have been breeding areas. And if we look at the black cap in the middle as a model, it is one that I've studied in the past. We're going to be looking at these in a bit more detail in the next few years here in Gibraltar. Black cap is particularly interesting because it has sedentary populations that do not migrate. It has fully migratory populations, but fully migratory populations that do not cross the Sahara. And it's got fully migratory populations that do cross the Sahara. So if you can imagine that within that species, different populations are doing different things today, and some of this may in some way reflect a legacy of the past. But we can but imagine what this world would have been like in the conditions I've described, say for the greener and wetter Sahara than today. Certainly they would have had it a lot easier than now, and we can speculate in terms of populations and what would have happened to populations. Right, moving on. This is where I live. Well, I don't live in the cave, but this is Gibraltar. And these are two caves. Got a cave here that I've been working on for many, many years now, so over 30 years. And this was, if you like, my second part of my research discoveries. I started off as a bird ecologist, I still am, but I discovered the world that could take me into the past and the Pleistocene. So we have been working here, this is Geraldine here, excavating every summer, and we'll be here now in May. We'll be excavating in the caves until mid-August, and I extend an invitation if anybody wants to come and visit us and see the work in progress. You're more than welcome. This is now a World Heritage Site declared by UNESCO in 2016. Why is this relevant? Well, the detail that we find in these caves is remarkable. The time span, the time frame of the cave glacial cycle, it starts at around 127,000 years ago and brings it to the present. The caves were occupied by people, largely populations of humans that we had decided to call Neanderthals. They were humans. But the level of, when you excavate, the level of detail of what you find is quite remarkable. Here we have, for example, ibex that had been hunted by the Neanderthals. This is a level dated to around 47,000 years ago. You can just see the teeth there and some stone flakes. But the preservation is remarkable. These are stone pine bracts. So the cases of the seeds for the stone pines are preserved. And here you can see the remarkable opportunities, but I just want to highlight it. Here, for example, you have an area that's similar to the one before, when the people left and the hyenas came in, spotted hyenas like you find today. And these are coprolites. This is the fossil droppings, fossilized droppings left by the hyenas as they came to scavenge into the campfire. And you'll see the significance of this in a moment. Bear with me. So back showing Gibraltar. This is at the moment the Mediterranean Sea is right up. We are in an interglacial. We are in a moment of warmth, and the sea level is up. But it wasn't for the greater part of the time. It wasn't up there. The sea level dropped by as much as 120 meters, and the coastline was as much as 4.5 kilometers out. And that is what made sense to the Neanderthals living in these caves, because they had a hunting ground. They had a savanna out here. Now, I cannot show you a picture of that, but we've worked with Mauricio Anton, who's one of the best, in my opinion, paleoartists in the world. And with a lot of detailed information we've given him, we can imagine what it was like. So you have, not very different from what I showed you before with Doñana, you have a system of dunes, sand dunes, and these pine savannas, bearing in mind the climatic conditions. I don't want to stray too much, but one of the things that we're finding here is that even at the height of the last ice age, when conditions, for example, the United Kingdom was under 1 kilometer of ice, even then the conditions here were very similar to today. you had a refugium here, and a lot of species then colonized further to the north were from populations that were down here and survived down here because of the latitude, the position. You still had long days in the winter, you had summer insolation, and so on. So this is just a representation compressed of what you would have had in a low sea level stand. This is where the cave is. You've seen the sea is there. This is what you would have had out there. And I could go into detail, but I don't want to stray. But notice the kind of environment, the seasonal lakes, what I've described for the Nyana, you had it here. And of course, it's not just red deer and ibex, you have hyenas and leopards. These things were there as well. We have a slightly distorted vision of some of these mammals as thinking them as exclusive to the African continent. Unfortunately, they're exclusive to the African continent because that's where we've allowed them to survive. Until not that long ago. But imagine the what we call non-analog communities that would have existed. Can you imagine a world with hyenas and wolves together, as an example? You don't find that anywhere, but you did here. So this is a hyena coprolite. I said I'd say a bit more. The dung of the hyena. And this has given us a lot of information because what we're finding is coprolites. We find those are the coprolites. We dissect them, we find pollen. And the reason is hyenas are carnivores, but they eat herbivores. They eat intestines of herbivores, and they swallow and the remains of the plants that the herbivores have been eating. So we can go back to a coprolite like this, which goes back to 50,000 years ago. We can dissect it. We find the pollen. We can reconstruct the landscape. We have an incredible record of the vegetation that was there. And throughout, even in the coldest periods, down here, you had these warm pine savannas that I like to call them, very much the kind of savanna landscape. It never went away, and not with the fauna. And you have a rich array of species, particularly reptiles and amphibians, as you can see here. A lot of these, this material gives us a lot of information of what's going on. And this is just a small selection, wonderful preservation for birds. If I tell you that we've now identified as subfossil material in these two caves, 161 species of bird, that's a third of the bird fauna of Europe. That gives you some indication as to the richness of the site. I don't want to go at length because it's not relevant to what I'm saying today. I would just touch that we are finding increasing evidence that it's people, it's the Neanderthals, and people are hunting these birds and bringing them back. That's why we find these remains there. If you're interested, later we can chat about that. But coming back to the main message, I've talked for half an hour, so I don't want to spend too much longer. But notice, and this is from a paper that we published in Tree a few years ago now, this is the limit of the cold fauna, the woolly mammoth. This is the other side of the story. The woolly mammoth, the reindeers, that is as far south as they got. So, and on both sides, on the European and the North African side of the strait, areas which were free of permafrost throughout, and the angiosperm trees, mainly oaks, and mesophilous pine trees. So it never got that bad. So if we're looking at, again, at similarities and affinities, again, there is very little to suggest that this part of the world has much by way of affinity with this part of the world in that sense. It's much closer to this. Here you can see there's at that moment on a very cold, dry moment. We could talk about that as well, but let's move on. So this is an infrared photograph taken. I see my picture's not there, I've disappeared. But anyway, it's above my head. Okay, this was last night above my head. We monitor swifts. I worked on these for my thesis 40 years ago, but now we've been playing with these birds now for 4 or 5 years now. At cameras, and we know when they're coming in. These are the first ones. They're first just arrived back from Africa. last night. And I thought I'd show you a picture of the pair already being intimate. And as you can see, it's our nest G. We have them all labeled and we monitor them very closely. So I just want to show you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing recently with these swifts. So we've been putting GPS, not geolocators, GPS packs on their backs to try and understand a little bit about what they're doing, essentially. One of the studies that we've got at the moment in progress has to do with what they do when they're here. And I don't want to extend myself there, but I can tell you that, for example, the feeding movements of these birds will take them on a daily basis, either towards the hinterland of the Iberian Peninsula, or equally, they will cross the straits to feed in North Africa and come back. So some of the food that the chicks in Gibraltar are being fed, actually insects caught in North Africa on a daily basis, which is quite incredible. But anyway, about migration, and this is something we published, I think it was last year, the year before. Two seasons, 18, 19, 19, 20 individual birds there, and several patterns emerged. This is from one colony, okay, above my head right now. And you can see there's a pattern immediately struck us, and that is that these swifts, these pallid swifts, will leave in August, and look, they go to the Sahel. The longitude may vary, but the latitude is very fixed. The same here, and for a very similar period, and they stay there until early November. Then they move gradually south and then into the rainforest, and then they come back. And we have some amazing examples of birds that, for example, were down here in the rainforest on the 31st of March, and on the 2nd of April, they were in the colony up here in 2 days. I mean, they decide to go and they go. Notice also that when they start the return movement, they seem to then go west before coming up north. And this pattern has been shown by others as well. So, and this is remarkable. We managed to actually track, and I think that the map speaks for itself, that the two colors are the routes and where the individual went. So the routes may have varied slightly, but look, it spent its time here from the 17th of August to the 28th of October, or the 21st of August to the 28th of October. But it's quite between for a short period, early November to early December, and then it spends the rest of the time here until March, and then they go this way again and back up to the colony. Very, very quickly. So this is a pattern, if you like, of one home, a second home, possibly a short third home, another home, and then back again. So it breaks the concepts of, I think we're all learning this from GPS now anyway, the traditional concepts of spring, summer, autumn, winter. So we could summarize what they're doing like this. Between April and August, they're in the colony in Gibraltar. The Sahara, they do very quickly. Then they spend these months in the Sahel, and then they move into the rainforest region, and then quickly back up with a bit in between. This is one individual, and what we're showing here is the time and the date and the speed at which it's flying and where it is. And what this is showing is actually an we would consider to be the Sahara. It's picking up speed on the 14th of August at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it goes across the desert, it goes for it, and it's reached the other side at 11 the next day. It's crossed in 1 day, on just over 1 day, which is quite remarkable. So we're learning a lot about what these birds are doing. So I'm coming to the end. I want to just give you a summary. This is mainly what I've been talking about for the Iberian system. I mean, we were talking about the system in Switzerland or Sweden, it'd be different populations of birds, different things. But really, you have the rains here between October and May. This is a historically variable area, the Sahara. Here you have rains August to October, and down here you have a rainforest. So if you're something like a white stork, you're moving between here, and when the rains stop here, you come back up. If you're something like a swift, you're doing that, but then when this becomes unsuitable, you don't go back up, for various reasons. Instead, you come down and then you go back up. So two ways of dealing with this. Incidentally, this photograph, which I took the year before last of a pallid swift flying around the colony, I didn't know at the time, but look, it's actually showing, I was really happy with this, actually see the aerial of the GPS showing through afterwards. So anyway, so that is the essence of what I want to talk to you. This is, just as a reminder, this is Europe, this is Africa. So thank you for your time.
Merci à tout le monde, merci au professeur pour cette belle entrevue sur les oiseaux migrateurs entre l'Afrique et l'Europe, de son point de vue, de son observation. Je crois que nos amis francophones sont très heureux d'assister à cette séance. Alors, beaucoup de choses ont été dites sur les généralités, en particulier en ce qui concerne la migration, les spécificités et la recherche donc du professeur et de son équipe sur les questions migratoires entre l'Europe et l'Afrique. Ce qu'il faut retenir, pour ne pas refaire donc la présentation du professeur, c'est que la migration elle est suffisamment spécifique selon les espèces et elle est discriminante par rapport aux différents lieux. Par exemple, certaines espèces pourraient faire des escales selon les conditions des milieux et finalement, on va dire que cette migration spécifique d'un milieu à un autre dépendra donc en plus des conditions du milieu de la période à laquelle la migration se fait. En gros, et pour ne pas, comme je l'ai dit, revenir sur tout le détail que le professeur Clive a fait, les présentations seront mises pour nos communautés francophones sur le site, de sorte qu'on puisse gagner du temps pour échanger avec le professeur. Merci encore une fois de plus, professeur Clive, pour cette très belle présentation. Thank you for your presentation, Prof.